South Africa is building a stock exchange for electricity. Okay, it's not exactly like the JSE, but it's a lot closer than most people realize. A few weeks ago, I attended Enlit Africa and walked into conversations about power trading, AI running electricity networks, independent power producers, and a complete redesign of South Africa's electricity market. The crazy part is most South Africans have no idea that this transition is underway. So in this video, I want to break down what I saw, why that matters, and why this is one of the biggest infrastructure stories of South Africa today. If you're anything like me, you probably grew up thinking electricity worked like this. Eskom makes electricity, Eskom sends electricity, and then Eskom sells that electricity. End of story. But that's no longer the future being planned. To understand what's changing, we first need to understand how we even got here. For decades, South Africa followed a vertically integrated electricity model. Eskom generated electricity, owned and operated the transmission network, distributed power through much of the country, and supplied customers. One organization was responsible for almost the entire value chain. And that model worked remarkably well for many years, if we obviously put aside the fact that Black South Africa was largely excluded from this. It enabled South Africa to build one of the largest electricity systems on the continent and supported rapid industrial growth. But by the 1990s, demand for electricity was rising much faster than new generation capacity was being added. Government recognized this challenge. In 1998, it published the White Paper on Energy Policy. The White Paper argued that South Africa couldn't rely on a single vertically integrated utility, Eskom, forever. It proposed three major reforms. Firstly, unbundle Eskom by separating generation, transmission, and distribution into independent entities. Secondly, create an independent transmission company that would operate the grid neutrally and give all generators fair access. Thirdly, gradually introduce competition, allowing independent power producers to generate and sell electricity alongside Eskom. Now, those recommendations might sound a little bit familiar, and that's because they're exactly the reforms that we're implementing nearly 3 decades later. Implementation back then had stalled due to intense political opposition from unions, severe government miscalculations regarding the energy supply, and a lack of legal framework for independent power producers. Meanwhile, electricity demand kept growing. Eventually, government had little choice but to continue building large power stations itself, and we all know how difficult that period became. And then fast forward to today, and South Africa is moving away from a single supplier electricity model towards a market with multiple participants. Eskom is no longer expected to be the sole producer of electricity. Independent power producers, otherwise known as IPPs, are also coming into the mix, and they're becoming a permanent part of the system. Companies like Pellegrin, who I adore so much, and I hope this year they grace us again with their presence at the E2E exchange, which will be hosted right here at UCT. But also groups like the Solar Group, Red Rocket, and Scatic ASA. Some sell electricity to Eskom, others sell directly to mines, factories, shopping centers, and businesses through long-term power purchase agreements. We'll come to that in a bit. Others just prefer to wheel electricity across the national grid to customers hundreds of kilometers away. None of this happens by accident. Markets don't emerge because companies decide they want one. They emerge because the rules change. And in South Africa, the most important change is the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act. It lays the foundation for a competitive electricity market by supporting Eskom's restructuring and enabling independent market participants. Other reforms like the new generation regulations and the expansion of the Schedule 2 exemptions have also opened the door for private generation and electricity trading. There goes that term again. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, but how do you actually trade electricity, Warona? Well, electrons don't carry a label saying this came from wind farm A. Instead, what gets traded is the right to inject electricity into the grid and the financial agreement for who pays for that energy. Today, most electricity is bought and sold using long-term power purchase agreements or PPAs. A mine, factory, or municipality agrees to buy electricity from a specific independent power producer for many years. The electricity then travels across Eskom's transmission network, and the generator pays a wheeling charge to use Eskom's infrastructure. Now, the second method is where things get really interesting. South Africa is preparing to move beyond fixed contracts into a wholesale electricity market. Instead of negotiating every deal individually, generators will now submit offers indicating how much electricity they can supply and at what price. It's traded across different time horizons depending on how certain buyers and generators are about future demand, with forward and futures markets, day-ahead markets, intraday markets, and finally balancing markets. The market operator then matches supply and demand, determines which generators should run, and calculates a market clearing price for that trading period. It's remarkably similar to how financial exchanges matches buyers and sellers, except that the product being traded is electricity. The important thing to remember is that electricity has to be balanced every second. Unlike many products, you can't simply leave today's electricity sitting in a warehouse until tomorrow. Every trade ultimately has to respect the physics of the grid. Now, to make this possible, the National Transmission Company of South Africa is developing SAWEM, which is the South African wholesale electricity market, only set to launch in the third quarter of 2026. This marks one of the biggest structural changes to South Africa's electricity market in forever, if you will. Now, this video barely scratches the surface of this. If you'd like to have a deep down, the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers will be hosting a webinar sometime in the month end of July. So I will be posting the link in the description below. Okay, this is the part that got me as an engineering student. Here's something people don't think about. South Africa's grid wasn't built for the future that we're headed for. For decades, the majority of our power came from one place, Mpumalanga, Emalahleni. Massive coal stations clustered together, sending electricity outward through the transmission lines designed around that single source. Mpumalanga was South Africa's generator, but now the story has changed. The best renewable resources in this country aren't in Mpumalanga. They are in the Northern Cape, the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, sun, wind, and space. That's where new IPPs want to build. Except the grid doesn't bend that way. The transmission infrastructure, the substations, the lines, the capacity to actually absorb and move that power was never designed to take large amounts from these regions and send it to where demand actually is. That's literally the backlog NTCSA is trying to work through right now. Now here's the second layer, and this is the part I only understood after visiting the City of Cape Town's Electricity Distribution Control Center. For most of the grid's history, control centers managed a small, known number of decision points, a handful of big power stations feeding one direction down to homes, which was easy to monitor and easy to coordinate, or relatively so. Now power is coming from everywhere. IPPs, rooftop solars on homes and businesses, small independent power producers scattered across a city. Every one of these a new data point the control center has to see, track, and account for, all in real time, just to know what's actually happening on the grid at any given moment. Now at a market layer, every one of these data points also comes attached to a contract, a price, and a decision about who gets dispatched. Control centers are literally processing an enormous, constantly shifting stream of information. Who's generating, how much, under what agreement, and at what cost, and making dispatch decisions of all of it fast enough to keep up with the grid that has to constantly balance every single second. But rooms like Enlit Africa reminded me that the future of your industry is being written right now. The infrastructure that underpins economic growth, industrialization, and the ambitions of 2063. I believe as a youth, we are being entrusted with the steering wheel of Africa. to steer towards an Africa we all want. Ladies and gentlemen, let's make this continent great. Wow.